Picture the Indian Ocean at twilight. The sun descends behind Madagascar, casting copper light across water that stretches beyond sight, beyond imagination. The waves roll in their ancient rhythm, patient as they have always been, concealing stories written in stone and sediment beneath their weight. Somewhere below, perhaps a mile down, perhaps only meters from the coral reefs that fringe Sri Lanka's southern coast, lies a question that has haunted poets, puzzled scientists, and stirred the dreams of those who believe the world was once arranged differently than it is today. The fishermen who cast their nets into these waters speak, sometimes, of structures their lines snag upon. Formations too regular, they say, to be the work of tide and time alone. The old men remember songs their grandfathers sang, verses in a Tamil so archaic that even they do not fully understand the words. Songs about land where there is now only ocean. Songs about cities drowned when the gods withdrew their protection, and the waters rose to claim what had once been garden and temple, marketplace and shore. Modern science has charted these depths with sonar and satellite, mapping ridges and plains that have not seen sunlight in 12,000 years. Yet even with all our technology, with all our certainty about continental drift and tectonic history, there remains a space, narrow but persistent, where myth and geology whisper to one another across the millennia. This is the story of Lemuria, a continent that may never have existed, a homeland that lives in legend, literature, and the disputed findings of underwater archaeology, a dream of drowned land that has captured imaginations from Victorian England to modern Chennai, from the drawing rooms of 19th century naturalists to the meditation halls of mystics who claim to remember lives lived under different stars on shores the sea has since erased. The question is not whether we can prove Lemuria existed. The question is why the idea refuses to die, why it surfaces again and again in disciplines that rarely speak to one another, in comparative mythology, in linguistic analysis, in the study of migration patterns, both human and animal. Why the name itself carries a weight of longing, as if the word remembers something we have collectively forgotten. As darkness settles over the Indian Ocean and the first stars emerge above the equatorial sky, we begin our descent, not into the water itself, but into the layered history of an idea, part science, part scripture, part dream. An idea that perhaps tells us as much about what we fear losing as it does about what may actually have been lost. The waves continue their endless work, revealing nothing, concealing everything. The year is 1864. London is at the height of its imperial confidence, cataloguing the world's wonders with the systematic enthusiasm of the Victorian age. In the offices of the Zoological Society, a Scottish lawyer turned naturalist named Philip Lutley Sclater pores over specimen reports from Madagascar, India, and the scattered archipelagos between. Sclater has noticed something peculiar. The lemurs of Madagascar, those wide-eyed, primitive primates found nowhere else in such abundance, share unmistakable similarities with fossil species discovered in India. The flora, too, shows strange kinship across thousands of miles of open ocean. How did these species come to be distributed in such a pattern? The prevailing theories of the day offer no satisfactory explanation. And so Sclater, in a paper presented to learned colleagues over afternoon tea and careful notation, proposes something radical: a land bridge, or rather, a continent now vanished beneath the waves, that once connected Madagascar to the Indian subcontinent. He names it Lemuria, after the lemurs whose distribution inspired the theory. It is, by the standards of mid-19th century science, a reasonable hypothesis. Continental permanence, the idea that the continents have always occupied their current positions, still holds sway in geological circles. The mechanism of continental drift will not be proposed for another half-century. If species could not have crossed vast oceans, and yet are found on distant shores, then surely the explanation must be that those shores were once joined. Other scientists take up the idea with enthusiasm. Ernst Haeckel, the German biologist, uses Lemuria to explain human origins, suggesting it as the cradle of mankind before Africa earned that distinction. The hypothesis appears in respected journals, is debated in academic halls, becomes part of the respectable discourse of natural history. But something curious happens in the decades that follow. As the 20th century approaches and geological understanding advances, as the theory of continental drift begins its slow ascent toward acceptance, Lemuria should fade from scientific consideration. The land bridge is unnecessary. Madagascar and India, separated not by sinking but by drifting, their connection severed not by flood but by the slow tectonic waltz of plates moving apart over millions of years. Yet the name does not disappear. Instead, it transforms. It migrates from scientific journals into a different kind of literature altogether, into the mystical texts of Theosophy, into Tamil nationalist writings, into alternative histories that speak not of lemurs and fossil distributions, but of ancient civilizations of spiritual, races of knowledge lost when the waters rose. Sclater's Lemuria was a hypothesis that lived for perhaps 3 decades before geology rendered it obsolete. But the Lemuria that followed, the Lemuria of imagination and indigenous memory, that continent would prove far more durable. It would sink into the scientific record only to resurface in myth, where it remains to this day undrownable, persistent as the tides themselves. In a London office, ink dries on a paper that names something that will outlive its own disproof. The dream of the drowned land has been given voice in the language of empire and science. But older voices in older languages had been singing of it all along. Long before Sclater named his vanished continent, before Victorian naturalists puzzled over Madagascar's lemurs, there existed stories. In the Tamil lands of southern India, poets gathered in what they called sangams, academies of literature and learning that flourished over 2,000 years ago. These poets spoke of a land called Kumari Kandam, a realm that stretched south from the tip of India, deep into what is now ocean. They described it as a place of 49 territories, where 3 sangams met across thousands of years, where the Tamil language reached its purest expression, in verses now lost to the sea that claimed the land itself. The Sangam literature that survives, fragments, really, preserved in later compilations, carries a peculiar melancholy. There is mourning in these verses, a sense of ancestral loss. The poets write of cities swallowed, of fertile plains becoming fishing grounds, of a time when the world was larger, and the Tamil people possessed lands that the ocean eventually reclaimed in not 1 but 2 great inundations. Medieval commentaries elaborate. The first Sangam lasted 4,000 years before the sea took it. The second endured for another 3,700 years, before it too was drowned. Only the third Sangam, situated in Madurai, safely inland, survived to pass its literature down to the present age. Whether these numbers are literal chronology or symbolic time is unclear. What is clear is the persistence of the memory. Something was lost to the water, something worthy of remembrance. Across the Indian Ocean, in the islands that would become Indonesia and Malaysia, similar stories circulate. Tales of Sundaland, a vast peninsula that connected the islands during periods of lower sea level, creating a superhighway for human migration until the glaciers melted and the waters rose. Local legends speak of ancestors who fled rising seas, who watched their hunting grounds become lagoons, their valleys become straits. Westward, in the Mediterranean cradle of Western civilization, Plato described Atlantis, a great island civilization that offended the gods and was swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of catastrophe. The parallels are striking, though the geographies differ. Drowned lands, lost wisdom. Civilizations erased, leaving only myth as their memorial. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a great flood that destroys the world, survived only by Utnapishtim, who builds an ark on divine instruction. In the Hindu tradition, The Matsya Purana describes how Manu, warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu, survives a deluge that drowns the earth. In Aboriginal Australian tradition, stories encode the flooding of coastal regions with such geographical precision that geologists have used them to map ancient shorelines. Flood myths are nearly universal. Every culture bordered by sea or river seems to carry some narrative of waters rising, of land lost, of survivors who carry forward the memory of what was drowned. Skeptics note that floods are common disasters, requiring no ancient cataclysm to inspire stories. Believers counter that the specificity and global distribution of these myths suggests something more, a genetic memory, perhaps encoded at the species level, of the post-glacial flooding that redrew coastlines worldwide between 15 and 7,000 years ago. Kumari Kandam occupies a unique position in this mythic geography. It is both specific. Tamil poets name rivers that once flowed through it, mountains that rose within its borders, and tantalizingly vague. No maps survive, if maps were ever made. No archaeological consensus supports its existence. And yet the literature continues to reference it, generation after generation, as if the loss is too significant to forget, even when the details have blurred with centuries of retelling. As the last light fades over the Bay of Bengal, one can almost hear the voices of those ancient poets, singing of what the water took. Their verses drift across the waves, like messages sealed in bottles, reaching us across an ocean of time, carrying a question we cannot quite answer. Is myth merely imagination given narrative form? Or is it memory, transmuted by centuries into something that sounds like fantasy, but began as fact? The distinction matters less, perhaps, than the persistence. Whether Kumari Kandam was real or imagined, it has become real in the cultural consciousness of millions. A homeland lost. A golden age ended. A cautionary tale about the impermanence of all terrestrial things, written in a language older than the maps we use to deny it ever existed. Meanwhile, in the laboratories and lecture halls of 20th century geology, a revolution was quietly unfolding. The theory of continental drift, proposed by Alfred Wegener in 1912 and initially dismissed as fantasy, gradually accumulated evidence too compelling to ignore. The continents were not fixed. They moved. They had moved dramatically over the Earth's history, riding on tectonic plates that floated upon the semi-molten mantle like rafts on a slow, viscous sea. South America and Africa fit together like puzzle pieces. Fossil records showed identical species on continents now separated by thousands of miles of ocean. Ancient climate indicators, glacial scratches, coal deposits, desert formations made sense only if the continents had once been arranged differently, had once formed a single supercontinent called Pangaea, and before Pangaea, even older arrangements. Gondwana, the southern supercontinent that included Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, the Indian subcontinent, and Madagascar. These lands were once neighbors, sharing ecosystems and species, before the slow force of plate tectonics pulled them apart over hundreds of millions of years. In this new understanding, Sclater's Lemuria became unnecessary. The lemurs of Madagascar and the related species of India shared ancestry not because a land bridge connected them in geologically recent times, but because their homelands had once been part of the same continental mass. The separation had occurred not through sinking, but through drifting, and not 10,000 years ago, but more than 80 million years ago, long before primates existed, let alone humans to name them or spin legends about their dispersal. The Indian Ocean, it turned out, was not a graveyard of submerged continents, but a relatively young basin, created as India broke from Gondwana and drifted northward to collide with Asia, raising the Himalayas in the process. The ocean floor was mapped, its basalt composition confirmed. There was no sign of submerged continental crust, no drowned landmass waiting to be rediscovered. Lemuria, as a scientific hypothesis, was dead. Yet here is where the story takes its strange turn. For while geology abandoned Lemuria, other disciplines, or perhaps more accurately, other impulses adopted it with fierce enthusiasm. A name that had been born in a London zoological journal now appeared in texts that had nothing to do with lemurs or plate tectonics, and everything to do with human history, spiritual evolution, and the search for origins that satisfied needs science alone could not address. In Tamil Nadu, Lemuria and Kumari Kandam became increasingly conflated. Here was a Western scientific term that seemed to validate ancient Tamil literature. If European naturalists spoke of a lost continent in the Indian Ocean, surely this lent credibility to the Sangam poets' descriptions of drowned lands. The fact that Sclater's Lemuria referred to a landmass millions of years old, while Kumari Kandam was described as a human civilization destroyed in recent millennia, was an inconvenience easily overlooked in the enthusiasm of cultural validation. Nationalist movements, particularly in colonial and post-colonial contexts, found in Lemuria a powerful symbol. Here was proof, or something that could be shaped into proof, that indigenous cultures possess deep, sophisticated histories predating Western civilization. If Kumari Kandam was real, then Tamil culture could claim roots older than Greece, older perhaps than Sumer. A drowned continent became a point of pride, a lost golden age whose memory legitimized contemporary cultural identity. And in the esoteric traditions of Theosophy and later New Age thought, Lemuria transformed into something else entirely, a spiritual prehistory, a realm where humanity took its first steps not just as biological beings, but as conscious ensouled entities. This Lemuria bore little resemblance to Sclater's hypothesis, or even to Tamil mythology. It was, instead, a canvas upon which Western occultists painted their visions of human origins, investing the lost continent with attributes and narratives drawn from imagination rather than indigenous tradition or geological evidence. 3 Lemurias, then, occupying the same name, but describing radically different things: the naturalist's land bridge, the poet's drowned homeland, and the mystic's spiritual cradle. Each version persists in its own domain, speaking to different audiences, serving different needs, largely ignoring the contradictions between them. In the offices where modern geologists work, Lemuria is a footnote, an interesting error in the history of their discipline, a reminder that scientific theories are provisional and must yield to better evidence. In the temples and cultural centers of Tamil Nadu, Kumari Kandam remains a living tradition, its reality asserted in the face of skeptical archaeology. In the bookstores that cater to spiritual seekers, Lemuria occupies shelf space alongside Atlantis and Mu, a lost world where ancient wisdom awaits rediscovery by those with eyes to see beyond the materialist limitations of conventional science. The continent that vanished from geology became, in vanishing, more present than ever in the human imagination. Its absence from the ocean floor did nothing to diminish its presence in the landscape of myth, where perhaps it belonged all along. The year is 1888. In London, a Russian émigré named Helena Petrovna Blavatsky publishes a massive, sprawling work titled The Secret Doctrine. The book claims to reveal the hidden history of humanity, a chronicle passed down by enlightened masters and recorded in ancient texts accessible only to initiates. In Blavatsky's vision, human evolution is not merely biological but spiritual. Consciousness itself evolves through a series of root races, each representing a stage in the soul's development across vast epochs of time. And Lemuria, here reimagined completely, becomes the homeland of the third root race, a crucial chapter in this esoteric prehistory. The Lemurians of the Secret Doctrine bear little resemblance to any culture described in Tamil literature or any hypothesis entertained by Victorian naturalists. Blavatsky describes them as giants, beings standing 12 to 15 feet tall, hermaphroditic initially, and only later developing into distinct sexes. They possessed, she writes, a third eye, not metaphorical but physical, located in the back of the head, an organ of psychic perception that would eventually atrophy as the race evolved, but which granted them direct communion with spiritual dimensions invisible to later more materialistic humanity. These Lemurians lived, according to Blavatsky's account, during the Mesozoic era, walking a lush tropical earth alongside dinosaurs. They had no language as we understand it, communicating through telepathy and primal sounds. Their civilization, if it can be called that, was not built of stone and metal, but of direct, intuitive relationship with the forces of nature. They were, in essence, more elemental than human, beings in transition from purely spiritual existence toward the dense materiality that would characterize later races. The destruction of Lemuria, in this telling, came through volcanic cataclysm and subsidence. The continent broke apart and sank over millennia, its survivors fleeing to become the ancestors of certain indigenous peoples, particularly those of Africa and Australia, whom Blavatsky's racial theories, shaped by the prejudices of her era, placed lower on the evolutionary hierarchy. The more advanced souls of Lemuria, according to her cosmology, would incarnate in the next root race, the Atlanteans, and then eventually in the Aryan race, the Theosophy positioned as the current pinnacle of human evolution. Modern readers will rightfully recoil at these racial classifications, which reflect the ugly hierarchies of 19th century European thought. Blavatsky's spiritual anthropology, for all its mystical trappings, smuggles in the same colonial assumptions that placed white Europeans at the apex of human development and relegated other peoples to primitive categories. This aspect of theosophical teaching has been rightly criticized and in more recent iterations often quietly abandoned or reinterpreted. Yet the image of Lemuria that Blavatsky created proved extraordinarily influential. It inspired countless spiritual seekers, artists, and writers who were drawn to the idea of ancient, non-technological civilizations possessing wisdom that modern materialism had lost. Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, elaborated on Lemurian prehistory in his own clairvoyant readings of the Akashic records, describing the continent's geography and the consciousness of its inhabitants in remarkable detail that, notably, often contradicted Blavatsky's own accounts. Subsequent occult literature, from the works of W. Scott Elliott to the channeled teachings of various New Age sources, continued to populate Lemuria with their own visions. Some described advanced crystal technologies. Others spoke of the Lemurians' harmony with nature, their vegetarian diets, their lack of ego or violence. Each author seemed to access a different Lemuria, as if the lost continent existed in some mutable dimension where each visitor brought back a reflection of their own ideals about what a spiritually evolved civilization should resemble. Importantly, this esoteric Lemuria bore almost no relationship to the Kumari Kandam of Tamil tradition. The Sangam poets had described a recognizably human culture: cities, kings, literature, commerce, agriculture. Theosophists described something far stranger: a pre-human or proto-human phase of existence, a time when souls were still learning to inhabit material forms, when consciousness operated according to laws entirely different from those governing modern humans. The conflation of these two traditions, the Tamil and the Theosophical, would cause considerable confusion in the century to follow. Tamil scholars seeking to validate Kumari Kandam often found themselves cited alongside Theosophists whose racial theories and fantastic timelines bore no relation to serious historical or archaeological inquiry. The result was a muddying of waters that served neither tradition well. Nevertheless, Theosophy succeeded in one crucial respect. It made Lemuria immortal in Western popular consciousness. The lost continent entered the imaginative vocabulary of the 20th century, appearing in pulp fiction, fantasy literature, and eventually film and television. It became shorthand for vanished wisdom, for knowledge deliberately hidden or accidentally lost, for civilizations that rose and fell, leaving no trace except the faint resonance of myth. In meditation rooms and esoteric study groups around the world, Students still attempt to access Lemurian consciousness through past life regression or channeled teachings. Whether what they access is genuine memory, imaginative reconstruction, or something else entirely remains a question that perhaps cannot be answered by any method available to us. What is certain is that Blavatsky's Lemuria, born in a Victorian drawing room and delivered through automatic writing and claimed mystical transmission, has proven as persistent as any geological formation and far more resistant to erosion. As we step back from the lurid visions of the secret doctrine, we might ask, what human need does this version of Lemuria serve? What longing drives the endless elaboration of prehistoric civilizations that conveniently left no evidence? Perhaps it is the same longing that animates all origin stories, the desire to believe that we came from somewhere meaningful, that our present confusion and violence are not inevitable, but represent a fall from some earlier grace. In this reading, Lemuria is less a place than a projection, a screen upon which we cast our hopes for human potential, our grief over what we seem to have become. The giants with their third eyes walk only in the landscape of vision, but the questions they embody walk among us still. Centuries before modern oceanography, before sonar could map the hidden topology of the seafloor, coastal peoples lived with an awareness that has only recently been validated by science. The shoreline is not permanent. Even now, if you visit the southern tip of India or the northern coast of Sri Lanka, you can feel the proximity of land across the Palk Strait. On clear days, the opposite shore is visible, a pale line on the horizon suggesting connection more than separation. Fishermen move between these waters, as they have for millennia, recognizing features of the bottom that speak of ancient continuity, of a time when crossing would have required no boat, only the patience to walk. Modern geology confirms what legend and shoreline topography suggested. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, global sea levels stood approximately 400 feet lower than they do today. Vast quantities of water were locked in ice sheets that covered northern Europe and North America. Coastlines extended far beyond their present boundaries. Entire continental shelves that are now submerged fishing grounds were then dry land, inhabited, hunted upon, known. As the glaciers retreated and the climate warmed, the seas rose. Not uniformly, not predictably, but in pulses that corresponded with the catastrophic collapse of ice dams and the sudden release of glacial lakes. One such pulse around 200 years ago raised global sea levels by several meters in less than a century, a geological instant, but slow enough that human communities would have experienced it as the gradual drowning of ancestral lands, the transformation of river valleys into estuaries, of coastal plains into archipelagos. In this context, the Tamil legends of Kumari Kandam take on new significance. When the Sangam poets wrote of two great floods that destroyed earlier academies and swallowed territories, were they encoding actual historical memory? Could the 49 lands they mourned represent real geographical features, river deltas, coastal plains, islands that disappeared beneath the rising Indian Ocean as the world transitioned out of the Ice Age? The timeline is provocative. The Tamil tradition speaks of the first Sangam ending around 9,600 BCE, the second around 5,500 BCE. These dates align suspiciously well with periods of rapid sea level rise documented in the geological record. The first corresponds with the beginning of Meltwater Pulse 1A, a period of dramatic flooding. The second coincides with the final stabilization of sea levels as the glaciers reached their modern extent. Archaeology adds tantalizing fragments to this picture. Offshore from Pumpuar, a historic Tamil port city, researchers using sonar have identified structures on the ocean floor walls, possibly, or foundations, arranged in patterns suggesting human construction. Skeptics argue these are natural formations, pareidolia leading enthusiasts to see design in random geology. Believers point to similar discoveries off the coasts of Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Sri Lanka, asking, How many underwater anomalies must be discovered before the hypothesis of submerged settlements earns serious investigation? The truth, as often happens, likely lies in nuance. There is no evidence of a continent in the sense that Sclater imagined or Blavatsky described. No landmass of continental proportions sank in the Indian Ocean in the past 10,000 years. The tectonic history simply does not allow it. But an extensive coastal region, populated by Mesolithic or early Neolithic peoples, gradually inundated by rising seas? That is not only possible, but virtually certain. Such regions would have existed all around the Indian Ocean rim, and their flooding would have displaced populations, destroyed settlements, and created the conditions for exactly the kind of cultural memory encoded in flood myths. The Tamil people, arriving in southern India at some point in prehistory, may well have inherited stories from predecessors whose lands were drowned. Or they themselves may have experienced the slow encroachment of the sea, watching over generations as the shore moved inland, as fishing grounds became too deep to easily work, as sacred sites vanished beneath the waves. In an oral culture, such experiences become narrative, become poetry, become myth. And in the process, details shift, timescales elongate or compress, geography becomes symbolic as much as literal. What emerges is a picture more complex than simple dismissal or simple validation. Kumari Kandam is not a continent in the scientific sense, but it may be a memory, distorted by time, elaborated by imagination, but rooted in the real experience of a people who watched the ocean claim what had once been land. The stones beneath the Bay of Bengal, the submerged ridges and shelves mapped by oceanographers, carry no inscriptions. But they hold space where humans may have walked, built, lived, before the glaciers melted and the waters rose to redraw the map of the world. In this light, the Sangam poets are not fantasists, but witnesses passing down through generations what their ancestors knew, that the earth is mutable, that what seems permanent can vanish, that the price of dwelling on the coast is the knowledge that the sea takes back what it once ceded. Their drowned land is not a mystery to be solved, but a condition to be mourned, the universal human experience of loss, writ in the particular geography of southern India, but resonant for anyone whose homeland has been erased by forces too vast to resist. The waves roll over the submerged plains, patient and indifferent, keeping secrets that perhaps were never meant to be kept, only forgotten. Let us return for a moment to the verses themselves. The Sangam literature, that body of Tamil poetry dating roughly from 300 BCE to 300 CE, represents one of the great treasures of Indian literature. Collected in anthologies like the Theosophical and the Patu Patu, these poems speak of love and war, of kings and landscapes, of the 5 geographical regions, Tenai, that structured both the physical territory and the emotional terrain of Tamil poetic convention. But threading through these verses, particularly in the later commentaries and introductions, is a persistent undertone of loss. The commentators speak of earlier Tamil kingdoms, of literary academies that flourished before the sea took them. The grammarian Nakara, writing in the medieval period, references the legend explicitly. 3 Sangams, 2 drowned, only the 3rd surviving to pass its wisdom to later ages. One verse, attributed to the poet Ilango Adigal, describes the Pandyan kings of ancient Tamil Nadu and notes that their territories extended 700 Kavatam to the south of the Kumari River. Since no Kumari River exists in modern India, the commentators explain, it flowed through the lost land and was swallowed when the land sank. The precision of the claim, 700 Kavatam, a specific unit of measurement, lends it an air of historical specificity, as if the poet were citing actual records rather than mythic geography. Another text, the Salapatikaram, describes the city of Kavarpatnam and notes its vulnerability to the sea. Indeed, the historical port of Kavarpatnam was eventually abandoned, not because it sank, but because the Kaveri River shifted its course and the harbor silted up. The interplay of myth and reality in these accounts is subtle. Actual coastal erosion and river delta dynamics, processes that did regularly alter the Tamil coastline, become enmeshed with legends of catastrophic inundation. The poets were, above all, craftsmen of emotion. Their purpose was not documentary, but aesthetic, to evoke particular Russ's emotional flavors, to align human feeling with appropriate landscape, to create beauty from language. When they spoke of lost lands, they were also speaking always about the impermanence that defines human existence. The drowned Sangam becomes a metaphor for all lost golden ages, for the inevitable decline that every culture fears awaits it. And yet, and this is the crucial point, metaphor does not preclude reality. The poets could be doing both, encoding actual environmental history in mythic language, while simultaneously using that history to make larger points about human vulnerability and loss. To read the verses as pure fantasy is to miss their sophistication. To read them as literal geography is to miss their art. Consider the way the poets describe the drowned land. It is fertile, abundant, a place where Tamil reached its highest refinement. This is the voice of exile, of displacement, of peoples who remember or who have inherited the memory of a time when resources were more plentiful, when the world was less constrained. Whether that memory refers to submerged coastal plains or to some other historical condition, a period of greater rainfall, a time before population pressure and competition for resources intensified, may be impossible to determine. What matters is the memory itself, the persistent cultural narrative that says, we came from somewhere else. We lost something precious. We carry that loss with us. Linguistic analysis adds another layer. The Dravidian language family, of which Tamil is the oldest extensively documented member, shows connections to other language groups in South Asia, and even some argue to pre-Indo-European languages of the Mediterranean and Near East. These connections are contested and speculative, but they raise intriguing possibilities. If the Dravidian languages are very ancient, and they appear to be, then they may preserve in their structure and vocabulary traces of geographical and cultural contexts vastly different from the historical period we can directly study. Place names in Tamil often carry meanings that seem to reference lost geographical features, rivers that no longer exist, mountains that cannot be identified. The linguist E. V. Ramasamy argued that these toponyms should be taken seriously as evidence that the Tamil-speaking area was once much larger, encompassing regions now underwater. Critics counter that place names are notoriously mobile, traveling with migrating populations and being applied to new landscapes that may bear no resemblance to the original. The debate is unlikely to be settled by armchair speculation. What it reveals is the power of language itself to carry history to preserve in its fossil record. Its archaic words, its unusual grammatical structures, its distribution patterns, information that predates writing and may encode truths that straightforward historical narrative has lost. The Sangam poets wrote for an audience that understood their references, that shared their cultural context. When they mentioned the drowned land, they were not explaining it to skeptics, but alluding to what everyone already knew. The loss was common knowledge, a shared grief that needed no justification. Millennia later, we encounter their verses as puzzles. We bring to them our own preoccupations, our scientific method, our hunger for proof, our tendency to divide the world into fact and fiction. The poets would not have recognized these categories. For them, truth wore many garments, literal, metaphorical, mythic, mnemonic. A story could be true on multiple levels simultaneously, and the question of whether the land had really drowned would have seemed, perhaps, beside the point. What matters, in the end, is that the verses survive. They are still sung, still studied, still mourned over. The lost land lives in them, in the devotion of those who read them, in the scholars who argue over their interpretation. Kumari Kandam may exist nowhere on any map, may have no coordinates that oceanographers can verify. But it exists in the Tamil language itself, in the breath of those who speak the verses aloud, in the continuity of a culture that refuses to let the drowned be forgotten. In that sense, the land has not sunk at all. It has simply changed its medium, becoming not stone and soil, but word and memory. And perhaps that is a more durable foundation than any continent. To understand the possibility of Lemuria, or more accurately, of the drowned lands that may have inspired its legends, we must turn our attention to one of the most dramatic transformations in recent Earth history, the end of the last glacial maximum and the subsequent rise of global sea levels. 20,000 years ago, the world was a different planet. Ice sheets several kilometers thick covered Canada, Scandinavia, and parts of northern Asia. So much water was locked in these glaciers that the ocean stood roughly 120 to 130 meters lower than today. The geography we consider normal, the shapes of coastlines, the divisions between continents and islands, is actually an anomaly, a brief interglacial configuration that has existed for only a few thousand years. During the Ice Age, much of what we now call the continental shelf was exposed and habitable. The English Channel was a river valley. The Persian Gulf did not exist. Instead, a river drained where now there is sea. Between Southeast Asia and Australia, a vast landmass called Sundaland connected the islands of Indonesia into a peninsula, creating a continuous landscape larger than India. The Bering Strait was a land bridge allowing migration between Asia and the Americas. And between India and Sri Lanka, the Palk Strait, that narrow channel that today separates the two, was likely a marshy lowland, easily traversable on foot, perhaps not even recognized as a boundary. The coastal plains extended far beyond their current extent. What are now underwater ridges and banks would have been hills and valleys, potentially occupied by Paleolithic peoples following game, fishing rivers, establishing seasonal camps. Then the warming began. Around 19,000 years ago, Northern Hemisphere summer insolation, the intensity of sunlight reaching the Earth, increased due to melanovic cycles, subtle variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt. The ice sheets began to melt. Slowly at first, then with accelerating intensity, the glaciers retreated. The sea level did not rise evenly or predictably. It came in pulses, separated by periods of relative stability. Around 14,600 years ago, a period known as Meltwater Pulse 1, saw sea levels rise by 10 to 15 meters in less than 500 years, possibly as little as a century. The cause is still debated. The catastrophic collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet? The sudden draining of glacial Lake Agassiz in North America? Whatever the mechanism, the effect would have been dramatic from a human perspective. Coastlines that had been stable for generations would retreat inland at a rate visible within a single lifetime. Another pulse occurred around 8,200 years ago, raising seas by additional meters as the last remnants of the North American ice sheet collapsed. By 7,000 years ago, sea levels had reached approximately their current position, give or take a few meters of subsequent adjustment. From the perspective of the people living through these transitions, the experience would have been profoundly unsettling. Coastal settlements and archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that Paleolithic and Mesolithic peoples favored coastal habitats for their rich resources, would find their shores advancing year by year, generation by generation. Freshwater sources would become brackish. Dry valleys would flood, becoming estuaries. Islands would shrink, eventually vanishing entirely beneath the waves. Some populations would adapt by retreating inland, carrying with them stories of what had been lost. Others might have attempted to stay, building on higher ground, watching as the places where their ancestors were buried disappeared underwater, as the hunting territories of their youth became fishing grounds of their old age. The timescale is crucial. This was not a single catastrophic flood, but a centuries-long process. For any individual, the change might seem gradual, even negligible. A few meters here, a few more there. But across the span of human memory, across the accumulated oral tradition of a people, the cumulative effect would be unmistakable. A massive loss of land, a redrawing of the world. Could this be the source of the flood myths that appear in cultures around the globe? The biblical deluge, the Tamil inundations, the Aboriginal stories of drowned landscapes. Could they all be cultural memories of the same geological event, filtered through different narrative traditions? Some scholars argue yes, pointing to the chronological overlap and the common themes. Others are skeptical, noting that floods are common disasters, and cultures need not have experienced global sea level rise to develop flood narratives. A local river flood, a tsunami, a storm surge. Any of these could traumatize a community sufficiently to generate myth. But there is something compelling about the global distribution of these stories, their recurring motifs of divine displeasure, and virtuous survivors of worlds ending and new worlds beginning from the remnants of the old. If the post-glacial flooding was as dramatic as geology suggests, and it was, then it stands to reason that peoples all around the world, wherever they dwelt near coastlines, would have experienced it and would have passed down that experience in story form. In this light, Lemuria or Kumari Kandam need not be a specific continent that sank. Instead, it becomes a name for something very real, the collective loss of coastal land experienced by all maritime peoples during the period of post-glacial sea level rise. The Tamil version of the story is their particular expression of a universal experience. The waters rose. The land was claimed. The survivors carried on, bearing the memory of what was drowned, encoding that memory in myth and poetry and warning. And millennia later, when oceanographers drag their instruments across the continental shelf and discover ridges and plains that were once above water, they confirm, without necessarily intending to, that the poets were right. Something was lost. The sea did take the land. Whether cities stood on that land, whether sangams met, and literature flourished, whether kings ruled 49 territories now submerged, these details remain beyond our current ability to verify. But the fundamental claim, the core of the legend holds. There was land where there is now ocean. Our ancestors walked there, and when the climate shifted and the ice melted, the water rose and took it from us. That much is not legend. That much is science. The modern search for Lemuria, for the drowned lands that may underlie its mythology, has entered a new phase. No longer the province of mystics and poets alone. The quest has been taken up by marine archaeologists, geologists, and oceanographers armed with technologies that would have seemed miraculous even a few decades ago. Sonar imaging, satellite bathymetry, remote-operated vehicles. These tools have revealed the hidden topology of the ocean floor in stunning detail. And what they show, in certain locations around the Indian Ocean, has provoked as many questions as it has answered. Off the coast of Tamil Nadu, particularly near the ancient port of Poonpuar, researchers have identified what they describe as structures on the sea floor at depths ranging from 5 to 20 meters. Side-scan sonar reveals linear formations, right-angled conjunctions, and material density changes that some interpret as walls, foundations, or paved areas. Preliminary investigations, including limited diving expeditions, have recovered pottery shards and other artifacts from the sites. The National Institute of Oceanography in India conducted surveys in the early 2000s, publishing findings that suggested human-made structures existed offshore, potentially dating back thousands of years. The media seized on these findings, proclaiming proof of Kumari Kandam and lost Tamil civilization found. The reality, as always, was more complicated. Geology offers alternative explanations. Beach rock formations created by the cementation of sand by calcium carbonate can mimic walls. Weathering patterns in basalt can create straight lines and regular shapes. Sedimentary layering, when exposed by currents, can appear disturbingly architectural. Without extensive excavation, a difficult and expensive proposition underwater, definitive conclusions remain elusive. Further north, off the coast of Gujarat in the Gulf of Kamhat, another discovery captured headlines. In 2001, marine archaeologists from the National Institute of Ocean Technology claimed to have found the ruins of an ancient city at a depth of 35 meters. Sonar images showed geometric patterns spanning several kilometers. Artifacts recovered from the site, wood, pottery, beads, were submitted for carbon dating, with some samples returning dates as old as 9,500 years. If verified, such a date would be extraordinary, predating the established chronology of urbanization in South Asia by thousands of years. But skepticism was immediate and fierce. Critics noted that carbon dating of isolated artifacts found in underwater sediment is problematic. The materials could have been displaced by currents, could derive from modern intrusion, could be contaminated. The geometric patterns visible in sonar, they argued, were more likely natural geological formations than city streets. The site remains controversial, with ongoing debates about the interpretation of the evidence. Some researchers continue to argue for human origin. Others dismiss the claims as wishful thinking imposed upon ambiguous data. The difficulty of underwater archaeology, the expense, the limited visibility, the challenges of excavation and preservation, means that definitive answers will be slow in coming, if they come at all. Off the coast of Sri Lanka, similar anomalies have been reported. Adam's Bridge, or Rama Setu, the chain of shoals connecting India to Sri Lanka, has long been a source of speculation. Hindu tradition holds that it was built by Rama's army of Vanaras, monkeys or forest dwellers, depending on interpretation, to reach Lanka. Satellite imagery shows the shoals as a clear line across the Palk Strait, looking uncannily deliberate. Geological surveys confirm that Adam's Bridge consists of a chain of limestone shoals. Core samples show coral, sand, and marine shells. The formation is generally agreed to be natural, a consequence of sedimentation and coral growth on a ridge formed during lower sea levels. Yet the alignment is striking, and local tradition refuses to relinquish the narrative of divine construction. In the Maldives, divers have reported stone structures on the seafloor, blocks that appear dressed, arranged in patterns suggestive of foundations. The Maldives, a nation of low-lying atolls, is acutely aware of sea level vulnerability. Its very existence is threatened by the modest rise predicted over the coming century. The idea that previous civilizations in the region were drowned by earlier sea level changes carries a grim resonance. And then there is the curious case of the Mascarene Plateau, a submarine plateau in the Indian Ocean between Mauritius and the Seychelles. Geological studies have revealed that this plateau is a fragment of ancient continental crust, a microcontinent that rifted away from India and Madagascar during the breakup of Gondwana. Zircon crystals recovered from beach sands in Mauritius were dated to 3 billion years old, indicating that continental crust does indeed exist beneath the ocean in this region. Some enthusiasts seized on this finding as proof of Lemuria's existence. After all, here was continental material beneath the Indian Ocean. But the timescale renders this irrelevant to human history. The Mascarene Plateau separated from the other landmasses tens of millions of years ago, long before humans or even primates existed. It is a geological curiosity, not a drowned civilization. What emerges from this catalog of underwater discoveries is a picture of ambiguity. Anomalies exist. Formations that some interpret as artificial have been documented, but the evidence falls short of the kind of undeniable proof that would compel consensus. For every artifact that suggests human presence, there is a geological process that could explain it. For every sonar image that looks like a wall, there is a skeptic who sees pareidolia. The ocean is vast, and we have explored only a tiny fraction of its floor. It is entirely possible, even probable, that settlements from the period of lower sea level do exist offshore, preserved under sediment, waiting to be found. As sea levels rose, coastal peoples would not have instantly abandoned their homes. They would have adapted, rebuilt on higher ground, perhaps even constructed seawalls or levees before eventually being forced inland. The remains of such efforts could lie submerged, fragmentary, and difficult to distinguish from natural formations. But the grand vision of Lemuria, of a civilization approaching or exceeding modern sophistication, of cities, and temples and roads spanning a lost continent, finds no support in the evidence so far discovered. What the ocean conceals, it seems, are modest settlements, coastal villages, perhaps ports and fishing communities, but not the cultural apex that myth describes. Unless, of course, we simply have not looked in the right places, or looked deeply enough, or with the right methods. The history of archaeology is littered with examples of discoveries that contradicted prevailing assumptions. Troy was myth until Schliemann found it. The sophistication of Göbekli Tepe rewrote our understanding of Neolithic capabilities. Perhaps somewhere beneath the Bay of Bengal or the Arabian Sea, evidence awaits that will force us to reconsider what we think we know. Until then, the ghosts beneath the Indian Ocean remain just that: suggestions, possibilities, hints that dissolve under scrutiny but never quite vanish entirely. The ocean keeps its secrets, yielding them slowly, ambiguously, in fragments that generate more questions than answers. And perhaps that is as it should be. Some mysteries deepen our engagement with the world more in their unsolved state than any resolution could achieve. Let us pause our broader narrative for a moment and focus on a single peculiar feature: the line of shoals that connects southeastern India to northwestern Sri Lanka, a formation known by two names, each carrying its own weight of meaning. To Hindu tradition, it is Rama Setu, Rama's bridge. The Ramayana tells how Lord Rama, seeking to rescue his wife Sita from the demon king Ravana, commanded an army of Vanaras to construct a bridge to Lanka. The Vanaras gathered stones and boulders, each inscribed with Rama's name so they would float, and laid them in a line across the strait. In 3 days, the bridge was complete, and Rama's forces crossed to wage war and reclaim what had been stolen. To cartographers and geologists, it is Adam's Bridge, a name bestowed by Islamic and Christian traditions that held it to be the route by which Adam, exiled from Eden, walked from Sri Lanka, identified by some as the location of paradise, to the mainland of India. The name first appears on Western maps in the colonial period, a designation imposed by European powers mapping territories they claimed as their own. Regardless of what we call it, the formation itself is undeniable. Stretching approximately 48 kilometers across the Palk Strait, Adam's Bridge consists of a chain of limestone shoals, sandbanks, and coral reefs. The water depth over most of the formation is less than a meter, and in some places the shoals are exposed at low tide. For centuries, it formed a navigable obstacle. Ships traveling between the western and eastern coasts of India had to go around Sri Lanka rather than through the strait. From space, the formation is even more striking. Satellite imagery shows a clear, near-continuous line of shallow water cutting across the deeper blues of the strait. The alignment is so precise, the line so straight in certain sections, that first-time viewers often express disbelief that it could be natural. And yet, geological studies confirm that it is. Core samples drilled through the shoals reveal layers of coral, sand, marine shells, and carbonate sediments, exactly what would be expected from a naturally forming barrier reef or shoal system. The age of the upper layers is relatively young, a few thousand years at most. Beneath that, older sediments speak to the formation's longer history. The current scientific consensus is that Adam's Bridge formed on an underlying ridge of Miocene limestone, a ridge that was exposed during lower sea levels and then partially submerged as the seas rose. Coral growth, sediment deposition, and longshore drift combined to create the chain of shoals we see today. But here's where the story gets interesting. During the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower, this ridge would have been well above water. It would have formed a land connection, not a constructed bridge, but a natural causeway, allowing dry passage between India and Sri Lanka. If Paleolithic or Mesolithic humans inhabited the region during this period, and they almost certainly did, then they would have crossed this land bridge routinely. It would have been a known route, a feature of their geographical knowledge, as familiar to them as any valley or mountain pass. When the seas rose and the connection became submerged or marshy, impassable, except perhaps at low tide or in certain seasons, the memory of the former continuity might persist. There was a way across, before the waters came. Such a memory, passed down through oral tradition, could eventually become mythologized, especially if later peoples, seeing the alignment of the shoals, interpreted them as the remains of a structure rather than a natural feature gradually being drowned. In this reading the Ramayana's account of Rama, S-Bridge becomes a mythologization of a geographical reality, a human story woven around a remembered landscape, embroidered with divine actors and miraculous construction, but rooted in the actual experience of ancestors who walked where their descendants could only wade or sail. This interpretation does not diminish the Ramayana as literature or as sacred text. It simply recognizes that myth often encodes genuine historical or environmental memory in symbolic form. The bridge was not built by Vanaras in 3 days, but it was once crossable, and that truth is preserved in the story. Interestingly, carbon dating of some materials from the shoals has returned dates of around 3,500 to 4,000 years ago for certain coral formations. This is roughly contemporaneous with the later Harappan period in South Asia, suggesting that the shoals as they currently exist are relatively recent in formation, though they rest upon much older limestone foundation. In 2007, the government of India proposed dredging a shipping channel through Adam, S-Bridge, to create a more direct route for maritime traffic. The proposal ignited fierce controversy. Hindu groups protested on religious grounds, arguing that the bridge is a sacred heritage site that should not be destroyed. Environmental groups raised concerns about the ecological impact on the Palk Strait. Archaeologists and historians debated whether the formation had any human origin worth preserving. The project was eventually shelved, not so much because of any consensus on the bridge's origin, but because the combined political, religious, and environmental objections made it untenable. What this episode reveals is the power of landscape to carry meaning, to be contested terrain, not just physically, but symbolically. Adam's Bridge is, from one perspective, just a geological formation, interesting but not unique, explicable within standard sedimentary and coral reef dynamics. From another perspective, it is a monument, a relic of divine action or ancient endeavor, a connection between myth and material reality that must be protected. Both perspectives are real. Both shape how we interact with the formation, what we allow to be done with it, what stories we tell about it. And in the tension between these perspectives, the mystery persists. Not because we lack information, geology has provided that, but because information alone cannot satisfy the human hunger for meaning, for connection to the past, for landscapes that carry more than just physical presence. Adam's Bridge stands, or rather lies submerged, as a reminder that the boundary between nature and culture, between geology and mythology, is not as clear as we might wish. The stones do not care what we call them or what stories we tell, but we care. And in that caring, the bridge remains what it has always been, a crossing point, a liminal space where worlds meet. Centuries before the first Dravidian grammars were written, before Sanskrit scholars codified the languages of the Vedic texts, a family of tongues was already ancient across southern India and parts of the subcontinent. The Dravidian languages, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam, and their smaller cousins represent one of the world's major language families, distinct from the Indo-European languages that dominate northern India and much of Eurasia. Linguists tracing the Dravidian family tree have encountered puzzles that geography alone cannot easily explain. The distribution of these languages suggests a much wider range in the past, before Indo-Aryan languages spread southward. Isolated pockets of Dravidian speakers exist in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and even Iran, linguistic islands separated from the main body by thousands of kilometers and centuries of migration and conquest. Tamil, in particular, stands out for its antiquity and conservatism. While other Dravidian languages evolved and borrowed heavily from Sanskrit, Tamil maintained a fierce independence, preserving archaic forms and resisting linguistic colonization with a stubbornness that mirrors the cultural pride of its speakers. The oldest Tamil inscriptions date to around 300 BCE, but the language they record is already sophisticated, suggesting centuries of prior development. Within the structure of Tamil and related languages, linguists have identified what they call a substrate, traces of even older languages that preceded Dravidian, whose influence can be detected in loanwords, place names, and grammatical oddities that don't quite fit the otherwise regular patterns of Dravidian morphology. Some researchers have gone further, proposing controversial connections between Dravidian and other language families. The linguist David McAlpin, in the 1970s, suggested a relationship between Dravidian and Elamite, the ancient language of southwestern Iran. The hypothesis, called Elamo-Dravidian, posits a common ancestor spoken perhaps 7,000 years ago, before the descendants of these early speakers migrated in different directions, some westward toward Mesopotamia, others eastward toward the Indian subcontinent. The theory remains contested, with many linguists arguing that the similarities McAlpin identified are too sparse and ambiguous to establish genetic relationship. But if the connection is real, it raises tantalizing questions about the routes these ancient peoples traveled and the landscapes they inhabited before historical records began. Meanwhile, other scholars have noted resemblances between Dravidian languages and the language families of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The Austroasiatic languages of Vietnam and Cambodia, the Austronesian languages that stretch from Madagascar to Easter Island. Could these share some deep, distant kinship with Dravidian? Could they all descend from languages spoken by peoples who inhabited the coastal regions of the Indian Ocean before rising seas fragmented their homelands? This brings us to a peculiar feature of linguistic geography. Maritime peoples often show language distributions that suggest former land connections. The Austronesian expansion, for example, which populated the Pacific Islands, appears to have originated in Taiwan and coastal southern China before spreading across vast ocean distances. But the pattern of expansion, island hopping, following coastlines, suggests that early Austronesian speakers were intimately adapted to maritime environments. What if a similar pattern existed in the Indian Ocean during the late Paleolithic and early Neolithic? What if the exposed continental shelves that connected islands and peninsulas during lower sea levels were inhabited by peoples whose languages formed the dialect continuum, a linguistic landscape that was shattered when the seas rose and separated populations into isolated groups? In such a scenario, the ancestors of Tamil speakers might have inhabited a much larger territory than the modern Tamil-speaking region, a territory that included now submerged coastal plains where they developed their language and culture before being forced inland or onto higher ground by rising waters. The linguistic evidence for this remains circumstantial at best. Languages change rapidly, and attempting to reconstruct relationships beyond about 7,000 or 8,000 years is extraordinarily difficult. The signal becomes noise. Too many changes have accumulated. The possibility of chance resemblances obscuring real relationships becomes overwhelming. But there are hints, breadcrumbs scattered through vocabulary, and place names that suggest deeper time than written records capture. Consider the Tamil word for sea, cattle. It appears in some of the oldest Tamil poetry, and its etymology within Dravidian is unclear, suggesting it may be a very ancient term, perhaps borrowed from a pre-Dravidian substrate. The word for fish, mijin, is similarly opaque, not easily derivable from known Dravidian roots. Place names along the Tamil coast carry similar mysteries. Names that reference geographical features no longer visible, rivers that cannot be identified with certainty, ports whose locations have shifted or vanished. Some scholars argue these are evidence of the mobility of toponyms, place names traveling with migrating peoples and being reapplied to new locations. Others suggest they are fossils, linguistic relics, preserving memories of a lost geography. The Sangam literature contains lists of rivers and mountains, kingdoms and cities. Some can be confidently identified with modern locations. Others remain uncertain or entirely mysterious. The commentators, writing centuries after the poems themselves, often confess they do not know what certain geographical references mean. This river flowed in the lost land, they explain, offering Kumari Kandam as the catch-all explanation for any reference that cannot be mapped to the known world. Is this evasion the invention of a convenient myth to paper over gaps in historical knowledge? Or is it preservation, the passing down of a truth that sounds like myth because the reference had vanished? Language carries history in ways that are both resilient and fragile. It can preserve words for things that no longer exist, words for extinct animals, for obsolete technologies, for landscapes that have been transformed beyond recognition. But it can also lose those words, forget them, or transform them so thoroughly that their original meanings become irretrievable. If the Tamil people, or their ancestors, experienced the drowning of coastal territories during the post-glacial sea level rise, we would expect traces of that experience to survive in language. And they do, in flood narratives, in place names that reference lost lands, in poems that mourn what the sea has taken. But proving a direct connection, demonstrating that a specific word or phrase derives from the experience of watching the shoreline retreat generation by generation, is nearly impossible with the tools available to us. What remains is the pattern, the recurring motif across multiple lines of evidence: linguistic, geographical, mythological. Each line, taken alone, proves nothing. But together, they sketch a picture that becomes harder to dismiss. A people adapted to coastal living. A language shaped by maritime experience. A memory, encoded in story and song, of land that was lost when the waters rose. Somewhere beneath the Bay of Bengal, perhaps, lie the places where Tamil was first spoken, where its earliest speakers told the first stories that would eventually become the Sangam classics. We cannot visit those places, cannot excavate them, cannot recover the voices that spoke there. But we can listen to their descendants, still speaking a language that bridges 4 millennia of recorded history, and likely much more of unrecorded prehistory. And we can wonder what words have been lost, what verses were never written down, what names for vanished rivers have slipped through the gaps in memory. The language of the deep is silence. But the languages spoken above it carry echoes, reverberate with overtones of something older than their oldest texts, something the sea claimed but did not entirely erase. As we move from linguistics to anthropology, from the study of words to the study of bones and genes, the question of Lemuria takes on a different dimension. For if we set aside the Victorian naturalists' continental theory and the Theosophists' spiritual prehistory, if we focus instead on the simple question of whether the Indian Ocean region once supported human populations that were later displaced or destroyed by environmental change, we enter territory where science can speak with somewhat more confidence. The story of human migration is, in many respects, a story of coastlines. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa sometime between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. For most of that time, we remained in Africa, adapting, developing language and culture, but not yet spreading globally. Then, around 70,000 years ago, something changed. A small population, perhaps just a few thousand individuals, left Africa, crossing the narrow strait at the southern end of the Red Sea when sea levels were lower and the distance to Arabia was minimal. From this small founding group, all non-African human populations descend. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. We carry the signature of that bottleneck, that moment when our ancestors took the first steps out of the homeland into unknown territory. The route they followed remains a subject of debate, but a growing body of evidence suggests that the coast served as a highway. Following the shoreline of Arabia, Persia, the Indian subcontinent, and eventually Southeast Asia and Australia, these early migrants would have encountered rich resources: shellfish, fish, seabirds, coastal vegetation that sustained them as they expanded into new territories. Crucially, these migrations occurred during the last glacial period, when sea levels were substantially lower. The coastline they followed is now largely underwater. The campsites where they paused, the shell middens they accumulated, the tools they left behind, all of this is buried beneath meters of ocean, preserved only if sedimentation covered it before currents could scatter it. Archaeological sites along the modern coastline can only give us partial glimpses of this coastal migration. We find evidence inland, at caves and rock shelters, of locations that were perhaps seasonal camps rather than permanent habitations. But the richest sites, the places where populations may have been most concentrated, are likely offshore, inaccessible to conventional archaeology. In this context, the idea of lost lands in the Indian Ocean becomes not fantastical, but almost inevitable. Of course, there were lands where humans lived that are now underwater. Of course, populations inhabited the exposed shelves and coastal plains. The question is not whether such places existed, but whether we can find them, and whether the people who lived there left any trace that time and tide have not erased. Genetic studies add another layer to this story. Analysis of Indian populations shows deep genetic structure, with the oldest lineages, those that diverged earliest from other human groups, concentrated in southern India and among tribal populations. This suggests that the subcontinent was occupied early in the out-of-Africa migration, and that southern India may have served as a refugium, a place where ancient lineages persisted, even as populations elsewhere were replaced or admixed by later waves of migration. Some geneticists have proposed that the ancestors of the Dravidian speakers represent an early migration into India, predating the arrival of Indo-Aryan speakers by thousands of years. If true, this would place the Dravidian peoples in southern India for perhaps 40,000 years or more, long enough to witness and remember the dramatic environmental changes that occurred at the end of the Ice Age. But memory at that timescale becomes problematic. Can oral tradition preserve information across 400 centuries? Most anthropologists would say no. The timescale is simply too vast, the cultural continuity too fragile. Yet there are suggestive examples from other cultures, particularly among Aboriginal Australians, where stories appear to encode accurate geographical information about events that occurred 10 or more thousand years ago. The geographer Patrick Nunn has documented Aboriginal stories from various parts of Australia that describe coastal features now submerged, that name islands that no longer exist, that speak of walking to places that now require boats to reach. When these stories are compared with geological reconstructions of past sea levels, they align with surprising precision. The implication is that some oral traditions can preserve accurate information across dozens of generations, perhaps even longer if the information is culturally significant and embedded in narrative, song, and ritual. Could Tamil flood myths represent a similar preservation? Could the Sangam poets be recounting, in mythologized form, the genuine experience of their ancestors who watched the post-glacial seas rise? The anthropologist Stephen Oppenheimer has argued that many of the world's flood myths originate not in local disasters, but in the global flooding that occurred between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago. He suggests that the myths represent genuine cultural memory, passed down through oral tradition, of the single most dramatic environmental change humans have experienced in our history as a species. Critics note that this requires extraordinary continuity of oral tradition. and that the same arguments used to support Oppenheimer's hypothesis could equally well support the interpretation that flood myths are independent inventions, responses to local flooding events that require no global catastrophe to explain. The debate is unlikely to be resolved without additional evidence, but it points to a fundamental question about human memory and culture. What do we remember? And how long can we remember it? If the answer is longer than we thought, then Lemuria or Kumari Kandam might indeed be memory, not of a continent in a Victorian sense, not of a spiritual homeland in the Theosophical sense, but of real coastal lands inhabited by real humans whose drowning was witnessed and mourned and passed down in story until the story became scripture. In this reading, Lemuria is not extraordinary but ordinary, not a lost civilization of advanced technology or spiritual wisdom, but simply home, the place where a people lived before the waters rose, the hunting grounds, the fishing spots, the valleys where ancestors were buried. Nothing more exotic than that, but nothing more precious either. For what is more worth remembering than the place we came from? What loss is more fundamental than the loss of homeland, of the landscape that shaped us, that held our stories before we could write them down? The dawn of humanity was also, in many places, the dusk of lands we would never see again. The price of surviving the Ice Age was losing the territories we occupied during it. The ancestors who walked coastal plains now drowned carry with them no monuments, no inscriptions, no artifacts beyond what stone and bone could provide. They are anonymous, unrecorded, vanished, except perhaps in the stories we still tell, in the myths that refuse to die, in the persistent, haunting sense that something was lost, something important, something that deserves to be mourned, even if we can no longer name it with precision. That is the Lemuria that anthropology hints at, not a fantasy, but a wound, not a mystery to be solved, but a grief to be acknowledged, the grief of all displaced peoples, of all who have watched their homes disappear, whether to water or fire or time's slow erosion. In the end, we are all descended from those who survived losing Lemuria, whatever name it carried, wherever it lay. And perhaps that is why the story persists, not because it is unique, but because it is universal. As we trace the contours of historical memory and geological possibility, certain archaeological sites around the Indian Ocean demand our attention. These are not lost continents, not civilizations of improbable antiquity, but real places, excavated, studied, debated, that nevertheless carry a whiff of the mysterious, a suggestion that what we know may be incomplete. Consider Dwaraka, the legendary capital of Lord Krishna, described in the Mahabharata as a magnificent city that sank beneath the Arabian Sea after Krishna's death. For centuries, this was considered pure mythology, a literary invention without historical basis. Then, in the 1980s, marine archaeologists working off the coast of Gujarat began finding evidence of submerged structures. The site, located near modern Dwarka, revealed walls, pavements, and what appeared to be the remains of a well-planned settlement. Artifacts recovered from the site, pottery, anchors, seals were dated to between 1,500 and 3,000 years old, placing them in the period of the Indus Valley Civilization and its successors. The structures themselves lay at depths consistent with submersion during historical times, possibly due to land subsidence or local sea level changes. The discovery generated enormous excitement. Here was apparent confirmation that at least some of the Mahabharata's geographical descriptions had basis in reality. If Dwaraka was real and submerged, what else from the epics might be historically grounded? But as with all such discoveries, the reality proved more complex than the headlines suggested. Skeptics pointed out that coastal settlements sinking due to subsidence or erosion is common and requires no epic narrative to explain. The dating of the site places it in a historical period, not the mythic timescale suggested by the Mahabharata. And the connection between these ruins and the specific city described in the epic remain speculative. Nevertheless, Dwaraka demonstrates that the coasts of India have been inhabited for millennia, and that submersion of coastal settlements is not hypothetical but documented. If relatively recent cities can sink, then earlier settlements from periods of lower sea level almost certainly lie even deeper and further offshore. Further south, near Mahabalipuram in Tamil Nadu, local legends speak of 7 pagodas, great temples that once lined the shore before 6 were swallowed by the sea. British sailors in the 18th century reported seeing temple towers submerged offshore. During the 2004 tsunami, when the sea briefly withdrew before surging back, witnesses claimed they saw structures on the exposed seafloor, walls, carvings, scattered stone blocks. In the tsunami's aftermath, investigations confirmed the presence of submerged structures offshore from Mahabalipuram. The shore temple, which stands today at the edge of the beach, appears to have been part of a larger complex that extended into what is now water. Subsequent excavations both on land and underwater have revealed additional structures, some carved directly from bedrock, dating to the Pallava period around 1,200 to 1,400 years ago. The site provides a fascinating case study in how natural processes and human legend intersect. The temples did exist. They did end up underwater, likely due to coastal erosion and possibly local subsidence or tsunami events. The legendary number 7 may be symbolic rather than literal, but the core of the legend, that there was more here than what survives today, is validated by archaeology. Even more intriguing is Pumpur, the ancient court city mentioned repeatedly in Sangam literature. The Tamil epic Silappatikaram describes it in loving detail. The bustling harbor, the warehouses filled with goods from across the sea, the lighthouse guiding ships to port. Then, the text says, the city was destroyed by a great flood sent by the sea god in punishment for an injustice committed by the Chola king. For decades, historians debated whether Pumpur was real or literary invention. In the 1990s and 2000s, marine surveys offshore from the modern town of Pumpur identified what appeared to be submerged structures, walls, streets, possibly a wharf, at depths of 5 to 10 meters. The National Institute of Oceanography conducted multiple surveys, mapping the site and recovering artifacts including pottery, beads, and Tamil Brahmi inscriptions. The dating remains uncertain, but the site appears to correspond with the historical period described in the Sangam texts, roughly the early century CE. Whether this is the Pumpur of Silappatikaram or simply a settlement from that general era near the modern town is debated. But again, the pattern is clear. Coastal settlements from ancient times do exist underwater, and their submersion has been remembered in local tradition. What these discoveries suggest is not that Lemuria or Kumari Kandam existed as a continent, but that the Tamil coast has been dynamic, with settlements rising and falling, land being lost to the sea through various mechanisms over various timescales. The Sangam poets were not fantasizing when they wrote of cities lost to the ocean. They were describing a pattern that had recurred multiple times in their history and prehistory. The question becomes, how far back does this pattern extend? If settlements from 1,500 years ago are now underwater, and if settlements from the Sangam period 2,000 years ago are submerged, might there be even older sites, from the Mesolithic or late Paleolithic, buried deeper still, further offshore, in locations that were coastal during the Ice Age, but are now on the continental shelf? The answer is almost certainly yes. The challenge is finding them. The continental shelf is vast, the sediment cover thick, and the methodologies for underwater archaeology at those depths and scales are still developing. Sonar can identify promising anomalies, but distinguishing ancient human structures from natural geological formations requires direct investigation, diving, excavation, analysis, at a level of expense and technical difficulty that limits how much surveying can be done. Moreover, Not all submerged sites are equally preserved. Where sediment has buried structures, they may be well protected. But where currents have scoured the sea floor, organic materials will have decayed, and even stone structures will be scattered and degraded beyond recognition. The probability of finding spectacular ruins decreases dramatically the further back in time we go. What we are more likely to find, if we find anything, are humble traces, stone tools, shell middens, perhaps hearths or post holes from structures built of perishable materials. These would be difficult to identify and difficult to date, but they would be evidence, concrete, material evidence, that humans inhabited the now drowned coastal plains. Such discoveries would not prove Kumari Kandam as the Sangam poets described it. They would not validate theosophical visions or nationalist aspirations for a Tamil civilization of great antiquity surpassing all others. But they would confirm the basic, modest claim underlying all the elaborations, that people lived where there is now ocean, and that their displacement by rising seas was significant enough to be remembered. In the temples and archaeological sites that line the Tamil coast today, we see the visible tip of a much larger story, most of which lies hidden beneath the waves. Each discovered site, Dwaraka Mahabalipuram, Pumpuar, is a reminder that the ocean is not a barrier to history, but a repository, holding secrets that we are only beginning to learn how to access. The civilizations of the Indian Ocean were never isolated. They traded, migrated, conquered, and merged across vast distances. And they built on shores that were always provisional, always vulnerable to the sea's slow reclamation. That some of what they built is now underwater is not extraordinary. What would be extraordinary is if it weren't. There exists in the margins of cartographic history a peculiar genre of maps, charts that mark lands no surveyor has visited, continents speculated into existence by the convergence of theory, tradition, and wishful thinking. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European mapmakers routinely included Terra Australis, Incognita, an imagined southern continent invented to balance the land masses of the northern hemisphere necessary, or so it was thought, for the Earth to maintain its proper equilibrium. Expeditions searched for it for centuries before finally concluding that the continent, if it existed at all, was much smaller and further south than imagined. Antarctica eventually filled the space, but not with the temperate paradise cartographers had dreamed. By the 19th century, cartographic convention had largely eliminated such speculations. Maps were meant to represent verified geography, the product of systematic survey and direct observation. Yet Lemuria appears on certain maps from this period, placed speculatively in the Indian Ocean by cartographers influenced by Sclater's hypothesis or by the romantic appeal of lost lands. These maps do not represent geographical discovery. They represent the projection of theory onto blank space, the filling of an absence with a name. But they are revealing nonetheless not for what they show, but for what they demonstrate, about the human impulse to complete the picture, to resolve the unknown into the known, even if the resolution is tentative, even if it is ultimately wrong. More intriguing than these European cartographic speculations are the indigenous maps and cosmographies that predate Western contact or that preserve traditions older than the colonial period. Tamil cosmological texts describe the geography of the world in ways that do not neatly correspond to modern understanding. They speak of the world as divided into regions, with Tamil lands extending much further than they do today, encompassing territories that must, in modern geography, lie beneath the sea. Some scholars have attempted to overlay these descriptions onto maps of the Indian Ocean during lower sea levels, arguing that the Tamil cosmography preserves memory of a more extensive landmass. The fit is imperfect. Ancient cosmographies were never intended as navigational aids, and their mixing of the mythic, symbolic, and literal frustrates attempts at straightforward interpretation. But there are curious correlations. Descriptions of rivers flowing through the lost land, when projected onto bathymetric maps, sometimes align with submarine channels carved during lower sea levels. Mountain ranges mentioned in texts find possible correspondences in undersea ridges. Islands that should not exist according to modern geography appear in old cosmographies at locations where seamounts rise to near the surface. Are these coincidences? Or do they represent the transmission of genuine geographical knowledge from a time when those features were above water or close enough to the surface to be navigationally relevant? The question is complicated by the nature of oral transmission. Details can be preserved with remarkable accuracy if they are culturally important and embedded in ritual or song. But they can also drift, be reinterpreted, be mapped onto new geographies when populations migrate or when the landscape changes. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires a level of specificity that ancient texts rarely provide. In Polynesian navigation traditions, we see an example of how sophisticated geographical knowledge can be preserved without writing. Polynesian wayfinders could navigate thousands of miles of open ocean, using stellar navigation, wave patterns, bird behavior, and mental maps of extraordinary complexity. This knowledge was transmitted orally and experientially through years of training under master navigators. It included information about islands, reefs, and currents that Western explorers would not chart until centuries later. Could a similar tradition have existed in the Indian Ocean? Could pre-literate or early literate Tamil navigators have possessed knowledge of the seafloor's topology, of banks and shoals that were once islands or coastal features? Could this knowledge, encoded in navigational songs or verses, have been preserved even after the features themselves were drowned? It's possible, though the further back we push such claims, the more speculative they become. What is certain is that ancient peoples were far more observant of their environments than we often credit. They noticed patterns, transmitted knowledge, and adapted to changes with a sophistication that the absence of written records can cause us to underestimate. There is also the matter of anomalous historical accounts, descriptions by Greek, Roman, or Arab geographers of islands or lands in the Indian Ocean that cannot be confidently identified with known geography. Ptolemy's maps include features whose locations and descriptions don't match any real places. Arab sailors spoke of islands and shoals whose positions shift suspiciously in different tellings. Some of these are simply errors, misidentifications, or deliberate misinformation. Sailors sometimes protected lucrative trade routes by spreading false information about geography, but others may represent the last echoes of geographical features that were in transition, sandbars that appeared and disappeared with seasonal currents, coral atolls that were building or eroding, or even genuine confusion about whether a place glimpsed once could be relocated on subsequent voyages. The ocean is mutable. The coast is mutable. And human memory of these places, transmitted across generations, becomes layered with meaning that transcends simple cartography. In the end, no map proves Lemuria. What the maps show us instead is the history of an idea, the way a name can travel from scientific hypothesis to mythic geography, can be plotted on charts as if reality can become real in the imagination, even as it remains absent from the seafloor. The map that shouldn't exist is every map that includes Lemuria. But perhaps the map that should exist, the map of coastal lands drowned by post-glacial flooding, the map of Mesolithic settlements now submerge, the map of ancient shorelines preserved in story and song, that map has yet to be drawn. Not because we lack the data. We have sonar, satellite bathymetry, sediment cores, archaeological surveys. We have the technology to map the drowned coasts in detail, exceeding anything available to previous generations. What we lack, perhaps, is the willingness to take the mythic geography seriously as a starting point. To ask, if the Tamil poets spoke of specific rivers and territories in the lost land, do those descriptions correspond to any features on the now submerged coastal plain? If Aboriginal Australians describe walking to islands now separated by deep water, can we map those walking routes and determine when they were last possible? Such investigations require a collaboration between disciplines that rarely speak, between archaeologists and mythologists, between geologists and literary scholars, between those trained to dismiss legend and those trained to preserve it. The map that shouldn't exist haunts the edges of our knowledge, a ghost cartography of places that may have been, people who may have walked there, stories that may contain fragments of truth too old and too strange for our categories to comfortably accommodate. Perhaps it's time we tried to draw it, not with certainty, but with curiosity, not to prove the myths, but to honor the possibility that they remember something real. Before we descend further into the archaeology and philosophy of lost lands, let us pause once more to consider a biological peculiarity that started this entire chain of speculation: the lemurs of Madagascar. Madagascar is one of the world's great biodiversity hotspots, an island that's separated from the African mainland approximately 165 million years ago during the breakup of Gondwana. Its isolation has resulted in extraordinary endemism. Over 90% of its species exist nowhere else on Earth. Among its most distinctive inhabitants are the lemurs, primates found in Madagascar and in fossil form in a few locations across the Indian Ocean region, but nowhere else. The question that puzzled Philip Sclater and his contemporaries was, how did lemurs end up on Madagascar? The island is separated from Africa by the Mozambique Channel, over 400 kilometers of open ocean. Lemurs are not strong swimmers, and the prevailing currents run the wrong direction for accidental rafting from Africa to Madagascar. Yet fossil evidence confirmed that similar primates once lived in India and even in parts of Africa. The distribution made no sense if the continents had always occupied their current positions. Hence, Lemuria, a land bridge that allowed migration, now sunken beneath the sea. Modern genetics and plate tectonics have provided the answer Sclater lacked. Lemurs likely reached Madagascar, not via a land bridge, but through rafting events during periods when ocean currents were different, or when storm events created natural rafts of vegetation that occasionally over millions of years carried small populations across the channel. Once isolated on Madagascar, these founding populations diversified into the remarkable array of species we see today. The ancestors of lemurs were already distributed across Africa and Asia before the breakup of Gondwana. As the continents separated, India drifting northward, Africa remaining relatively stable, Madagascar splitting from both, populations became isolated. In most places, lemurs eventually went extinct, outcompeted by newer primate lineages, including monkeys and apes. Only on Madagascar, where these competitors never arrived, did lemurs persist and flourish. So Sclater's hypothesis was wrong, at least in the form he proposed it. There was no recent land bridge. The distribution of lemurs is explained by ancient continental drift and occasional oceanic dispersal, not by a drowned continent. But here's the enigma. While Sclater was wrong about Lemuria, he was responding to a real puzzle in biogeography. And while his solution was incorrect, the fact that similar species are found on now distant landmasses remains true. Madagascar's flora and fauna share affinities with India and Africa that require explanation. That explanation, plate tectonics, is more extraordinary than any land bridge. It requires continents to move, to split, and rejoin over timescales so vast they dwarf human history. It requires us to envision the Earth as fundamentally dynamic, the crust floating on a molten mantle, driven by convection currents that rearrange geography over hundreds of millions of years. Lemuria, the Victorian hypothesis, was timid compared to continental drift. It proposed a modest sinking of a landmass over relatively recent geological time. Continental drift proposed that all landmasses are in constant motion, that the map of the Earth has been redrawn dozens of times since life began, that mountains rise and erode, oceans open and close, and that the very ground beneath our feet is sailing slowly across the planet's surface. When Alfred Wegener first proposed this idea, he was dismissed as a fantasist. The established geologists of his day considered continental drift more absurd than any Victorian speculation about sunken lands. The mechanism was unclear, the evidence circumstantial. The whole idea seemed to violate common sense. Continents were solid, stable, permanent. They did not move. It took decades for the evidence to become overwhelming, for seafloor spreading to be documented, for paleomagnetism to reveal the history of Earth's magnetic field frozen in rocks, for GPS measurements to finally show that yes, the continents are moving at rates measurable in centimeters per year, slow but inexorable. The lesson here is double-edged. On one hand, it shows how scientific understanding progresses, how hypotheses that seem reasonable at one time are replaced by better explanations as evidence accumulates. Lemuria, the land bridge, gave way to plate tectonics, and science is better for it. On the other hand, it reminds us that extraordinary claims are not always wrong. Continental drift was an extraordinary claim. It overturned centuries of geological common sense. And it was right. This does not mean that every extraordinary claim deserves equal credence. Most extraordinary claims are wrong. But it does mean that dismissing an idea merely because it contradicts current understanding is a risky move. The history of science is littered with examples of established consensus turning out to be incorrect, of mavericks being vindicated after decades of ridicule. So where does this leave Lemuria? Not as a land bridge for lemurs, but as a human homeland drowned by rising seas. The claim is nowhere near as extraordinary as continental drift. We know sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the Ice Age. We know coastlines were submerged. We know humans inhabited those coasts. The only question is whether any of those submerged settlements were significant enough, remembered clearly enough, to generate the legends we find in Tamil literature and other flood traditions. That's not extraordinary. It's actually rather mundane. The burden of proof is not insurmountable. It requires archaeology, which is difficult underwater, but not impossible. It requires taking oral traditions seriously as potential sources of historical information, which academics are increasingly willing to do. The lemurs of Madagascar led Sclater to propose Lemuria. The lemurs didn't need Lemuria, as it turned out. But the hypothesis opened a space in the imagination, attached a name to the idea of drowned lands, and that name is proven impossible to fully abandon, even after its original justification vanished. Perhaps the lemurs, in their wide-eyed nocturnal way, were always a bit of a red herring. They pointed to a real mystery, biogeographical distribution, but the solution lay in deeper time, in tectonic processes, not in land bridges. The real Lemuria, if it exists, is not about lemurs at all. It's about us. About human populations displaced by environmental change. About the stories we tell to preserve the memory of loss. About the shoreline between myth and history, between what we can prove and what we remember. The lemurs, blinking from the trees of Madagascar, are indifferent to these questions. They survived their isolation, diversified, became one of evolution's remarkable experiments in adaptive radiation. Whether we called their island Lemuria or Madagascar matters not at all to them. But to us, the name matters. It carries weight, history, longing. And perhaps that's reason enough for it to persist, even if the lemurs no longer need it.